lovely to be here this evening. We were asked to do this quite some time ago, and it was then COVID interfered, of course, and then was going to be on Zoom. But it's great to be here in person in the little museum. And as I was getting the bus in here from UCD after a day of lecture, so hopefully my voice will hold out, I was on the phone to my sister and I said, "Oh, I have to go now. I'm doing the icon thing in the little museum." And she said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm talking about the icons lecture." And she said, "Oh, Marilyn Monroe." Margaret Skinnider would be the furthest thing from Margaret Monroe that you could think about. But as you can see in this image that was created of her for the Royal Irish Academy's series of prints in 2016, actually she looks quite stylish as a dispatch carrier, which she did serve as during the Easter Rising in 1916. So I want to introduce you to Margaret, the subject of a biography I wrote on the Life and Times series published by UCD Press, and you can go online and buy the book at UCD Press. Paid you homage to Noel, my publisher. I've done the brief of selling the book. Margaret was not born in Ireland. She was born in Scotland. So I want to make the argument that a Scottish lady born in Coatbridge and then grew up mostly in Glasgow, of Irish heritage, her father was from Monaghan, could be an Irish icon. She came to militancy in Scotland. So her life in Scotland is quite important. Her life in Glasgow is quite important. And it's here she joins the Women's Social and Political Union, the Pankhurst organisation of militant suffragettes. And indeed, the ones in Glasgow were particularly militant because mostly they were working class women who joined the organisation there. And as one of them, Jessie Stevens, said, "Our militancy in Scotland took many forms, such as the smashing of plate glass windows, going into art galleries, and even attempts to burn down castles and stately homes." They were not women to be reckoned with. They also tried to bomb the reservoir that served Glasgow, but the homemade bombs failed to go off. Now, interestingly, there is no evidence that Margaret was part of that, although her home was very near that said reservoir, and she did have a militant turn in her. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if she was taking a bomb up to the reservoir. She was also influenced by a type of Catholic socialism that was very common and important among the Irish diaspora in Glasgow, and joined the Independent Labour Party in Glasgow. And socialism informs her life for all of her life. Trade union activism becomes one of the vehicles through which Margaret reaches, I would argue, iconic status in our history books. She was also very much involved in cultural nationalism, learnt Irish, was very much engaged in Irish history. The family used to go home to Monaghan to visit family there, so she knew all the stories of landlordism and the famine and immigration and all the dark histories as they were told in Irish immigrant population. So when the Na Fianna were set up in Glasgow in about 1912, she's one of the first who helps train them. And then when the Irish Volunteers were set up, she is associated with them, and she joins Cumann then, the Anne Devlin branch of Cumann in Glasgow in 1915 when it's set up. And this is all before she gets involved in Ireland at all. So she is still coming to militancy in Glasgow. Helen Crawford, who was a socialist, very important woman in socialist history in Glasgow. She ran the organised the rent strikes during the First World War in Glasgow when rents were put up because of speculating by the military-industrial complex. And we can talk about that even today. Rents were being put up, and the poor women of Glasgow organised to basically keep the rents at an affordable level. And so Crawford is very important to this, was also a militant suffragette, spent some time in prison. And we know Margaret is very important in this because Crawford mentions her in her unpublished diary. She says that Margaret had no time for kings and queens. And when she was protesting outside Perth prison, where a number of suffragettes were imprisoned for their militancy, Margaret comes along in 1914 and allows Helen to go and protest a visit of the King and Queen to Glasgow because Helen wanted to go and do that, so Margaret is there. So she's very much involved and very much engaged in militant suffragette, in militant nationalism, before she even sets foot in Dublin. She meets many of the organisers of the Easter Rising in Glasgow because they go there to speak to the Irish diaspora. The Glasgow, Belfast, Dublin triangle is very important in the importation of arms and ammunition. This is important for Margaret's life as well, as I'll tell you in a moment. And so she meets Countess Markievicz, she gets to know James Connolly, and more importantly, she gets to know his daughter, Nora Connolly, who becomes her best friend. And she and Nora will remain besties, basically, for the rest of their lives. And they live in Dublin. They go on holidays together. We have photographs from the family archive showing them together at all stages in their lives. And indeed, they remain activists together as well. But her association with Countess Markievicz is important in these early years of her militancy, particularly her militant nationalism. And it is at Markiewicz's invitation that she comes to Dublin in December 1915 to talk to the leaders of nationalism there. And it is on Markiewicz's instigation that she gets associated with the Irish Citizen Army. Even though she's a member of Cumann na mBan in Glasgow, it is with the Irish Citizen Army that she fights the 1916 Rising. And probably that's where Margaret's true ideology would have been most represented, because socialism for her and trade union activism was as important as her nationalism. When she comes to Dublin, she impresses Markievicz with her abilities to pass as a Fianna boy. And here is this famous photograph of her. She was a lifelong smoker, as you can see. She would have been about 21, 22 here, so she's dressed in the Fianna outfit. And in her book, Doing My Bit for Ireland, published in 1917, which I'll talk about in a minute, she talks about that visit to Dublin. A number of things impressed her. Connolly, Sean McDermott. She was I suppose what impressed her mostly was the need to free Ireland from the depredations of imperialism. One of the first places she visited were the tenements in Dublin. She was horrified at the poverty and the living standards of the people there. She was a mathematical teacher, so at this stage she's working as a maths teacher in Glasgow. And so Connolly asked her to do drawings based on her abilities with maths of Beggar's Butt Barracks in case they decided to try and take that in the Rising. And apparently then she used her femininity she threw her handkerchief over the wall and got a passing man to hoist her up onto the wall so she could look inside and see the buildings and then do a quick sketch of them. And apparently Connolly was very impressed with her sketching. She also impressed them with her ability to use arms and ammunition and a gun, because she had joined a women's rifle club in Glasgow that had been set up once war broke out in 1914 in case the Germans invaded and the women of Britain had to defend themselves. But as Margaret says in Doing My Bit for Ireland, she became a crack shot, but not to shoot at Germans. She was going to be shooting at somebody else. Interestingly, and this will become clearer later on, this is the photo that appears in Doing My Bit for Ireland. This is the original photo. Somebody decided that this was a bit too risque for inclusion in the 1917 book. So Margaret comes to Dublin. She returns to Glasgow after her visit, but she knows she has to be back in Dublin in 1916 at Easter time. And she returns the weekend before the Rising is about to take part, or to break out. There is a passage in Doing My Bit for Ireland where she talks about coming out of Mass on Sunday, ready to join the Irish Citizen Army and march on Stephen's Green. And she sees the headlines that the Rising has been called off, of course, by Owen MacNeill and people like the O'Rahilly and others taking that message around the country. And then she goes to Liberty Hall where she's told, no, it's going to happen tomorrow. And so come prepared. So she's ready to go. She arrives in Liberty Hall early on Monday, and she is sent as an advance scout on her bicycle to Stephen's Green. And there's a wonderful passage in Doing My Bit for Ireland in which she describes seeing the green uniforms of the Irish Citizen Army in the dappled sunlight, through the leaves of the trees, marching up Grafton Street on their way to Stephen's Green. And it is there she will spend the week of the Easter Rising. Now, obviously, she spends most of it here in the Royal College of Surgeons. She is a dispatch carrier in the first days. She says she was outside the GPO carrying a dispatch from Michael Mallon to the GPO, GHQ at the GPO, when Pearse was reading the proclamation. So she says she heard it. That proclamation becomes a touchstone in her life. She has a big argument with Michael Mallon later in the week, and she refers to the proclamation. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. However, in the College of Surgeons, by Wednesday, they've retreated there from Stephen's Green because, of course, Stephen's Green is just there. I'm looking out on it. They were being pinned down from the Shelburne. The British, they hadn't managed to take over the Shelburne, and the British military had them pinned down with some machine guns. So they retreat to the College of Surgeons. And by Wednesday, dispatch carrying had become too dangerous. So she changes out of her dress, we saw on her bicycle, and she changes into a uniform that Markovich had made specially for her, which she describes, and she becomes a sniper for the rest of the week. And she said she saw more than one fall when she fired her gun. It's interesting that she, as a dispatch carrier, was dressed as a young woman, because, of course, she could pass easily through the streets. The British soldiers weren't taking any notice of these young women. Not until later in the week, where they do arrest a few of them and do badly mistreat them. So Margaret was very lucky in that sense. But once she decides she's a soldier, she dresses in the male uniform. And she talks about that in Doing My Bit for Ireland, that this was a sort of a masculine thing that she was doing, but women could do it, but you had to perform it in that masculine sense. She has the argument with Mallon, because they are pinned down by a sniper in the Royal College of Surgeons. And she has a plan. Well, firstly, she was going to try and bomb the Shelburne, but that would have been very difficult to do. Her plan, the sniper was on the corner of Harcourt Street, and her plan was to smoke him out and then kill him. And he couldn't pin down the Royal College of Surgeons. She was all into the killing. She didn't really. She was there fighting as a soldier. She didn't have any problem with that. These were the enemy. So she leaves the Royal College of Surgeons on a sortie with Frank Robbins, one or two others, and a young boy called Fred Ryan, who was 17 years old. They are creeping up towards Harcourt Street, and then Robbins tries to open a door so they can hide in a doorway, and his gun goes off when he bangs it against the door, and Sniper hears, fires, hits Fred Ryan, kills him, and hits Markovich 3 times. She is very badly wounded. And she is taken back to the College of Surgeons, where they operate on her to get the 3 bullets out, and they save her life. It is testimony to the first aid training that Dr. Kathleen Lynn had given the women of the Irish Citizen Army, that they were able to save Margaret Skinnider. It is also the reason why she is never arrested after the Rising, because when they surrender in the Royal College of Surgeons, her hero, Markovich, is marched off to jail along with Michael Mallon, whom she had said to him, when he said she couldn't lead that sortie. She said, the proclamation says women are now on an equality with the men, and so therefore we can do whatever the men can do. And this would be her mantra for the rest of her life. Women needed equality in society. It was part of her feminism and her socialism, particularly working class women she fought for. When they are marched off, Margaret is taken to St. Vincent's Hospital. At that time, was on the other side of the green, with Markovich's will hidden inside her clothing. And she spends the next few weeks between life and death. She was quite badly injured, and then she gets pneumonia. And eventually she comes round, only to discover that several of her comrades, Connolly, Michael Mallon, Sean McDermott, Tom Clark, are all dead. They have been executed, and Markovich is in prison, had been sentenced to death, but that's commuted to life imprisonment. Nora Connolly comes to tell her and says that in her last visit with her father, James, before he was taken to be executed, he asked after Margaret. So Margaret is very much part of the Connolly family as well at this stage. So Margaret, anyway, recovers, goes back to Scotland, but she's a changed woman at this stage. She does get some work as a teacher, part-time work, but she's very much involved and engaged in Irish nationalism now, militant nationalism. So towards Christmas of 1916, she and Nora Connolly joined Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in America on the Republican Women's Propaganda Tour. And basically what they're doing, along with women like Nellie Gifford and various other members of the Cumann na mBan, is they're trying to publicize and propagandize the Republican cause to Irish America for various reasons: fundraising, psychological support, political support, and they're seen as a danger. I have seen written documents that say that Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Margaret Skinnider, and Nora Connolly in their speeches are creating a problem for America in making its decision whether to join the war or not on the side of the British. They want to stop that. Obviously, they don't succeed, but they do succeed in propagandizing the rising in various ways. Margaret writes one of the first eyewitness accounts of the rising written by a woman in 1917. Now, she isn't anything I would call a beautiful writer. There's some lovely passages in Doing My Bit for Ireland, but she's a very practical woman, and it's very practical prose. A simple recital, as the critical evaluation of the book said, is that it makes the Irish revolutionaries live for us, especially their executed leaders, so that the Irish question presents itself as an essentially human problem, and the rights of small nation changes for a battle cry to demand for constructive thought. So Doing My Bit for Ireland goes into several publications and it sells out in America and does have an impact again on that propaganda tour. And another important thing on the propaganda tour is Margaret meets the person she was going to spend the rest of her life with. This is Nora O'Keeffe, from the O'Keeffes of Glenach in County Tipperary, a Fenian family. Her brothers are involved in the Irish Volunteers. Her sister Bridget is also in Cumann na mBan. The family home will be burnt out during the Black and Tan War or the Revolutionary War. Nora herself is in Cumann na mBan. She had immigrated to America in 1909 with her brother and meets, as far as I can tell, there's no direct evidence, but they're back together in 1919 in Dublin. So they must have met in America, probably in New York, among the Irish-American community there. Nora is a propagandist, a journalist, and a writer, and they lived together in Dublin from 1919 until 1962, when Nora dies. Interestingly, when Margaret died in 1971, her executor burnt all her diaries. She was a daily diary keeper. I almost cried when I heard this, because you can imagine, I mean, Doing My Bit for Ireland is very well written, and she writes a lot about poverty and class and politics and the people and the personalities, and she's quite good descriptive style. So her diaries would have been very important. At the moment, I'm working on the diaries of Kathleen Lynn, so I can see how important those diaries are. And he burnt them so that her private life would not make it into the history books. Well, I'm sorry, but it did. Because I was able to reconstruct their private life through letters. Both of them are great friends with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, with Nora Connolly. Photographs that I got from both the Skinnider descendants and the O'Keeffe family, as well as conversations with the descendants of both women, and reconstruct that private life, that they were together as a couple, but also as activists together throughout this period. Because, of course, when the War of Independence broke out, they're both members of Fairview, Cumann na mBan, and they both fight in the War of Independence. Interestingly, here, Margaret fights in the War of Independence as a Cumann na mBan woman. She doesn't do the uniform changing as she did in 1916, because it's a very different war. It is a guerrilla war, and women have to remain hidden. So no uniform is necessary. In fact, the uniform of just your normal dress of a woman is what makes the Cumann na mBan women so effective. So she's a fundraiser, propagandist, dispatch carrier, intelligence gatherer, and doing all the things that the Cumann na mBan women did during this period of the War of Independence. When the treaty is signed, both of them are vehemently anti-treaty. Margaret is on the executive of Cumann na mBan, and her speech at the 5th of February 1922 meeting to discuss the treaty by Cumann na mBan absolutely rejects the treaty out of hand. This was not what she signed up for when she swore an oath to the Republic as proclaimed in the 1916 proclamation. Again, I go back, this is the touchstone. Not just about women, but about the Republic she fought for as well. She will not take another oath. So the oath of allegiance, she cannot take. And she said, anyone who takes the oath of allegiance cannot consider themselves an Irish person. They are involved in the fight for Dublin. As soon as the forecourts are taken, both Margaret goes there and sets up Cumann outposts just in the vicinity. She's involved with the Glasgow women who are importing arms for the anti-treaty forces, and indeed commandeers an ambulance at one stage to deliver a whole pile of arms to Hammond Hotel, where Cathal Brugha is holed up after the fall of the forecourt. Nora goes to her native Tipperary, where she runs a propaganda news sheet until she is arrested. Margaret is arrested in December 1923. After the fall of Dublin and the arrest of Austin Stack, she becomes the Quartermaster General of the IRA. And after she is arrested, her friend Nora Connolly becomes the Quartermaster General of the IRA, controlling all the funds nationally of the anti-treaty IRA until she is arrested. So this is how important the women are to the anti-treaty side. She's in Mountjoy Jail. This is a picture of her in the North Dublin Union, again with a cigarette somewhere there. In the Mountjoy Jail, she's the director of training, so she keeps the women active. They're playing camogie, they're playing rounders, they're doing all sorts of things to keep their spirits up. She also goes on hunger strike 3 times because of overcrowding. She endures the violent transfer of the women from Mountjoy, where they're beaten basically onto the trucks when they're taken to the North Dublin Union. She spends most of a year in jail. She's arrested in December 22 and is released in November 23. And that's the first time she sees Nora. Both of them end up back in their home in Clontarf. At this stage, they're both living in Seafield Avenue in Clontarf, where they live for the rest of their lives. So the North Dublin Union was a place of discomfort, hunger, cold, and dearth. So after the Civil War, Nora and Margaret find themselves on the losing side. They're both members of Cumann still and will remain on the executive of Cumann for the next decade. They reject the Irish Free State. They reject the Oath of Allegiance. They campaign for anti-treaty women who run for office and then don't take their seat in the Dáil. They have a very hard time financially because they can't get employment, like many of the anti-treaty IRA and Cumann. Margaret applies for the military pension when the first legislation comes out in 1925. She applies. Cumann are not included in that military pension, but of course Margaret was fought as a member of the Irish Citizen Army, who are included in that. So she applies as a member of the Irish Citizen Army. Now, interestingly, 2 women apply for the pension in 1925. One is Bridget Lyons Thornton, who'd fought as a member of Cumann in the forecourts in 1916, but was pro-treaty and was a medical officer, the only woman in the Free State Army in 1922-23, and indeed is the medical officer in Kilmainham Jail, where she had been imprisoned in 1916. So she is now basically the warder of women she had fought with in 1916, and that shows the split in the women is as difficult and traumatic and bitter as the split in the men. And many of the Cumann women who join the pro-treaty Cumann Saoirse are called Cumann searchers by the anti-treaty Cumann because they perform the function of women searchers when these Cumann women are arrested. And there's real bitterness there between them. That bitterness, though, will be dissipated by a common enemy they both face as you go on into the Irish Free State, and I think you can all guess what that was. So into the 20s, when she applies for the pension, it's refused because the reason given is it's a military pension for soldiers in the masculine sense. So Margaret's contribution, her sniping, her wounds, everything didn't count for anything, but really why she didn't get it, because Bridget Lyons Thornton did get hers, is because she was anti-treaty, and Cosgrave was determined that no anti-treaty person would get a pension. And it's only in 1932, when the second pension legislation is passed, that the Cumann women can apply, and the anti-treaty people, because of course it's when Fianna Fáil come into power and they can't not give the pension to the anti-treaty people. Eventually, however, she nearly did become president of Cumann. She was beaten in the last vote by McAuliffe. And Nora O'Keefe writes a very sniffy letter to the executive of Cumann at the time that they had denied the presidency of the organisation to one who really deserved it. I think there was a bit of bias there, but eventually Margaret gets a job with the Sisters of Charity in North King Street as a teacher first, just as substitute, and then in 1928 as a full-time job. Nora Connolly O'Brien said she would not tolerate any teacher in the school not being a member of a union. So the first thing she does on joining the sisters and getting work there is join the INTO, the Irish National Teachers Organisation. And it is through that and through Clon na Publica and a few other organisations that Margaret will be carrying out her activism for the rest of her life. In 1992, the INTO were notified by letter, in 1932, notified by letter that all women national teachers who qualified on or after the 1st of April 1932 shall, on marriage, cease to be eligible for recognition in any capacity in a national school, a marriage bar. And that was going to affect teachers until 1958. Obviously, the marriage bar did not affect Margaret Skinnider. She did have a partner, but obviously it wasn't 2015 and marriage equality had not been introduced, so they were not married. So it never affects her personally, but she takes it personally because she is a woman and she recognizes the inequality it is delivering to women workers. And it becomes one of her lifelong aims to have this overturned. And it was overturned in 1958, 2 years after she stepped down as president of the INTO. But that was one of her lifelong aims. As a teacher, Margaret apparently was a brilliant teacher. I've spoken to some of her past ex-students. She really believed in the value of education, particularly for girls. And of course, the cohort of girls being educated in North King Street would have been coming from the tenements and surrounding areas of North Inner City Dublin. Apparently on Fridays, she'd been told not to talk too much about what she'd done during the revolutionary period, but apparently on Fridays she's pulled down the blind on the door and tell girls hair-raising stories about Easter 1916 and getting shot and show them that she couldn't lift her hand over her head because of the bullets that she had taken in 1916. But there is widespread admiration for her as a teacher, and indeed I think in the school now they have a Margaret Skinnider auditorium in her honour. She did lots within the INTO and she climbed the ladder in the INTO. She was very much involved in the Dublin branch, which was the radical branch of the INTO. And particularly in 1946, the big 1946 strike of the teachers in Dublin, she's on the strike committee with one other woman, Bridget Bergen, or a couple of other women, but one other who will become a president of the INTO, Breed Bergen. This would be Skinnider's first major public action as a member of the INTO. That she was trusted enough to be on the strike committee was a measure of her commitment to and work in the INTO, particularly in the Dublin branch. This strike was to last 7 months. They played the All-Ireland late that year, it was in October, and at halftime, the teachers marched out onto the pitch with this is them in Croke Park. And of course, the Taoiseach of the day, De Valera, was there, and apparently he was not too happy with seeing the teachers marching out. The strike ended without a good resolution for the teachers, and it was the Archbishop of Dublin who kind of negotiated an end to the strike. But it does set down a marker for what the striking committee were looking for. It was fair play, equal pay for women teachers, unmarried women teachers, obviously married women teachers didn't exist, for unmarried women teachers and unmarried male teachers to get equity of pay with married male teachers. An ideological construct that a married man supported a family, therefore an unmarried woman and indeed an unmarried man didn't deserve the same sort of pay because they weren't supporting a family. And that is the beginning of that. And she sits on the Rowe Commission on fair play and teaching standards. She was very much involved in the idea of the type of teaching and education that should be delivered, that teachers should be trained properly, that it should be of an international standard, that teachers should also to develop the whole child in the education system. On the 23rd of April 1957, she made her presidential address to the INTO Congress in Killarney. All of her ideas about the profession and the role of the teacher were reiterated here. She knew that teachers were depressed and stressed, plus ça change, by low wages, overcrowded classrooms, and veiled threats of dismissal. So teachers should belong in a profession that was not controlled by a tyrannical pressure. They are, she said, entitled to their academic freedom, to responsible participation in scholastic efforts, to respect in the community, and to remuneration to enable them to maintain standards proper to their position as professional men and women. It reflected her deeply held ideologies: proper pay and equal pay for teachers, no matter their gender, proper training and development of teachers, and an adequate work environment where teachers could educate the youth of Ireland for the cause of Ireland. And of course, that was always part of her cause as well. In the 1940s, she did join Clan na Poblachta. She had known Maud Gon McBride, of course. They all knew each other, all these women who were involved in the revolutionary period, particularly those who lived and worked in Dublin. And so she knew Sean. She knew Noel Brown. She did run for election for Clan na Poblachta in the Dublin district, and you would think she would have, had a good chance. But actually, she put her name down in Irish, and it is quite a strange Irish name, and actually I can't even pronounce it. And she thinks that's why she didn't get elected. Nobody recognised it, that it was her on the ballot paper. But she believed in Clan na Poblachta. She worked on the Fair Price Commission. She worked with the Irish Housewives Association and anyone who campaigned for fair prices, for better living conditions, for equal pay and better pay for all, even outside of the teaching profession. When she was elected president in 1956, she went to Manila in the Philippines and represented the INTO at the International Teachers Federation there. So she was a very well-respected woman. Now, the INTO president just serves a year and then they step down. And so she retires from teaching and the INTO in 1958. But she doesn't retire from activism. She becomes the first chairperson of the Women's Advisory Committee of ICTU, an advisory committee that still exists to this day. The committee was to advise the Executive Council of ICTU on issues relating to women in the trade union movement. Its role was to further trade union membership among women generally and advise on economic, industrial, and social matters of special concern to women workers. She had begun her activist career as first wave suffrage feminism began and was an active member of that. She's now ending her career and seeing the beginning of second wave feminism. While the Women's Advisory Committee had a hard time trying to get the trade union men to see women's issues as important and campaigns for equality as important, it did have a major, the advisory committee had a major impact on campaigns for equal pay and equal treatment in the 1970s. She, as I said, lived her life with Nora. Nora died in 1961, and Margaret never had a relationship with anybody else. How I was able to look at their lives together is this amazing photographic album of the Skinnider family, which shows them in different phases of their lives. Here they are here. They raised wolfhound dogs to championship standards. Here they are with members of the O'Keefe family in older age. And here they are with Nora's in the white dress, Margaret's in the middle, and Nora's sister, Bridget. So they were integrated into their Skinnider and O'Keefe families. They went on holidays together. They went, the Skinnider albums show them on holidays with Nora O'Keefe and Nora O'Connolly and Ina Connolly. They had a cottage in the Midlands. I can't quite recall where. They would visit Monaghan. They went to Scotland. Interestingly, Margaret's mother drowned in the sinking of the SS Ronan coming from Glasgow to Dublin in 1920. It crashed into another ship and it sank. Also on that was an African-American jazz group who were coming to Dublin for the first time, and half them drowned, and that was what made the headlines. However, I did find a piece of paper in the military archives that said, Nora O'Keeffe, infamous dispatch rider, survived the SS Rowan. And they think the SS Rowan exploded because there were munitions in the hold that were being sent from Glasgow to Dublin, and Nora was bringing them. So interestingly, the interrelationship between the O'Keeffe, Nora, and the Skinnider family was the same as with Margaret and the O'Keeffes. They used to go to Tipperary on holidays. After Nora died, every year on the anniversary, this notice would appear. In loving memory of my dear friend, Nora O'Keeffe, late of 134 Seafield Road, where Margaret was still living, Clontarf, who died on August 12, 1961, Sacred Heart of Jesus, grant her eternal rest, mass offered, Margaret. So every year that appeared until Margaret died. In 1966, Margaret was interviewed by everybody, RTE, Radio 1, the Survivor's book written by Unshin McOwen. And she gave all sorts of talks in schools and to the INTO. She was invited back onto the platform with her medals, talking to the INTO about remembering 1916. So it was very good of them to celebrate a Scottish woman. As she said, Scotland was my country, but Ireland was my nation. In 2016, she was remembered very well. There was an exhibition in the College of Surgeons. She was part of that. The Royal Irish Academy made her one of their members of, or people who fought in 1916 that was on buses and platforms all around the country. And here in Monaghan, where Margaret Skinnider's family were from, they put up this huge monument to her, as well as a roundabout in Monaghan town, the Margaret Skinnider roundabout. But here on the family home, made from stone, that came from the old family homestead, it no longer exists. They put up this, and it was unveiled in 2020 to Margaret Skinnider. In Coatbridge, there's the Margaret Skinnider Centre. In Glasgow, they celebrated her as well. So the connection between Skinnider and her various parts that she came from, her various places of origin, were commemorated and celebrated in 2016. And I wrote this book, Margaret Skinnider, available from UCD Press, very affordable price. And if you go onto UCD Press, you can get it. This is Margaret in 1914, before she becomes an Easter Rising fighter, before she becomes an INTO member, before she becomes that woman who will fight for the rights of Ireland, for the rights of labour, women workers particularly, and for the rights of women. The three great causes identified by Countess Markievicz, her great friend, whom she is buried beside in the Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery. So I ask you to vote for Margaret Skinnider, icon extraordinaire.